Good afternoon. Hello, everyone. I hope you had a good lunch and that you're ready for some stimulating couple of panels. During the first 45 minutes, we're going to solve the biology of aging, and then we have 45 minutes left to take care of all the diseases associated with aging. Should be easy, and then after that, you can have coffee. But let's start without further ado, and then we'll get some questions during the panels, during the discussions, also from through the web, and we'll hear about that later. First of all, Cynthia, let me start off. I was intrigued and stimulated by the discussion before lunch, and there seems to be a bit of a controversy here, because biologists feel that there is a biological process of aging, but the human demographics really suggest that it's absence of disease, and if we can prevent diseases, people live longer, and it seems to go on. Is there really a biology of aging?
Well, it's very interesting. There is this is a question that you can talk about for weeks and weeks and weeks. It's a big question. To what extent is aging just a collection of diseases? It's interesting. There are diseases called progeria diseases. And what a progeria disease is accelerated aging. And it's called a disease. And just imagine if it's perfect aging, but it's faster. It's called a disease, and the reason it's called a disease is because not everyone gets it. So the real reason aging is not called a disease is because not everyone gets it. If just some people do and others don't, it is, and that's what you see with progerias. So that's one answer to the question, but it's not a very deep answer. It has to do with semantics and how you name things. The next question is, to what extent is the natural aging process, which you can basically, you know it when you see it. You can judge a person's age by their face, which is actually a good predictor of their chronological lifespan and their future, how long they will live in the future. You can judge it that way. To what extent is the decline in tissue integrity and behavior and strength and mobility that you see with age, to what extent is that caused by diseases, or to what extent does that cause diseases? And it's hard to know. I personally think that when you look at these long-lived animals, or you look at species that have longer lifespans compared to shorter lifespans, what you tend to see is that the overall health of the species, like your dog, even if your dog doesn't have a disease, if it's 11 years old, it's not the same as it was when it was a young adult. You know that. It has maybe some gray hairs, but it's not just that. So there's something besides just an overt disease that's obvious, and you can see. So the way I think of it is that there is something having to do with aging. We don't call it a disease because everyone gets it. Although if you had a 90-year-old and a 20-year-old and you were blinded to them and you were just asking them to tug on a rope, you'd probably say, well, this one's got something wrong with them because they can't really. But it's not. If they're 90, then it's fine that they can't tug as hard. Anyway, so I would say that the diseases of aging, like cancer and heart disease and Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, those actually are diseases. Not everyone gets them. That's why we call them diseases. And they're connected. There is a cause-effect relationship. Aging is a risk factor for those diseases, but they're separate. And when these long-lived mutants that age more slowly, you can measure the slowness of aging independently of diseases. You can look at their grip strength, if their balance, their intelligence, and these features slow down. And they also tend to get the diseases of aging later in life and also in a more mild form, for the most part.
So I guess the answer was yes. Thank you, Cynthia. I forgot to introduce the panel, but you already met Cynthia, Kenyon, Tom Kirkwood, and Liz Blackburn. Nils Larsson is at the Max-Planck Institute for Aging in Cologne, in Germany, and Craig Mello at the University of Massachusetts. And I'm glad to announce to the audience that we've increased the age here by, or lifespan, of the panel by 3 years, since both Craig and Liz have received the Nobel Prize. Nils, you wanted to comment on Cynthia's points.
I mean, I think one has to be a bit careful with diseases, because when do we have a disease, that's actually defined by humans, right? I mean, diabetes you have when you have a certain amount of glucose in your blood in the fasting state. Amyloid plaques you can have in the normal aging brain, so there is clearly an overlap. And I think also these premature aging syndromes I wouldn't consider as aging, because I think they are in essence pediatric syndromes, and all of them have components that you wouldn't find in normal aging. For instance, Hutchinson-Gilford progeria have scleroderma, which is thickness of the skin. So I think one has to be a bit careful there. In my opinion, I think it's very difficult to dissociate age-associated disease from aging, but of course not everyone may agree with me.
Tom?
Yes, this is a question that comes up over and over again in our field, sort of the relationship between intrinsic aging and diseases. And to some extent, it's a human decision-based distinction that doesn't respect the underlying biology. And the underlying biology is that, aging, we believe, is driven by an accumulation of molecular and cellular damage. And most age-related chronic diseases are also driven by an accumulation of molecular and cellular damage. And each disease has its own particular cocktail of kinds of damage. So the connection between intrinsic aging and age-related disease is much deeper than many people acknowledge. And I think what we will see as we go further into this century, I hope, is that within medical research, we will begin to see some joining of these agendas. As it is now, within a country like Sweden or the UK or the US, we have big institutes devoted to individual age-related diseases. So we have institutes related to cancer, institutes related to cardiology, institutes related to diabetes. You ask how many scientists work within those institutes that do anything about aging, and the answer is tiny. Yeah. And we have just a few institutes that are dealing with the intrinsic biology of aging. But I would hope that 50 years from now, every major medical institute that is working on diseases relating to aging will have whole teams of people that are trying to understand the intrinsic aging mechanisms that are contributing to this. And I fear what they will do is they will look back on our era and they will say, how could it have taken so long?
But at least you have a start in Newcastle where you have a school of age for aging.
We have, yes. I mean, the great thing in Newcastle is that the whole of the Faculty of Medical Sciences has adopted aging as its overarching thematic priority. And for me, that's a kind of personal vindication of what I've been trying to say to my clinical colleagues, which is, look, you've been working on aging all your career, but you just haven't recognized it, and things will change. And just, if I could, one interesting thing about this connection, we've been running in Newcastle a big population-based study, the Newcastle 85+ study, where the design was very simple, to go out starting in 2006 and try to recruit everyone in the city born in 1921, and then to study in great detail their health and trajectories. And what we find is that out of the more than 1,000 people in the study, at age 85, no one has nothing wrong with them. And 75% of the cohort have 4 or more age-related conditions, even though 4 out of 5 of them say that their health is good, very good, or excellent. But what it means is that the future of medicine is also looking at multi-morbid conditions, which are the reflection of aging at work in the bodies of those individuals.
So can I just make a short comment? So in age-associated diseases, I mean, the genetics have had real difficulties to identify inherited mutations. I heard a diabetes scientist saying that 10% of diabetes is explained by 100 different loci. So it could well be that age accumulated the various types of damage or somatic mutations will actually contribute to these diseases and may explain some of this missing heritability in line with what you are saying.
And that brings us very nicely over to discussing what is actually the mechanism of aging. And as we all know, several different hypotheses have been put forward. Is it telomere shortening? Is it oxygen radical-induced damage to nucleic acids and other macromolecules? Is it protein aggregation? Is it a finite number of cell divisions, as Hayflick once proposed? Are there epigenetics changes, perhaps caused by nutrients, that matter here? I mean, we are reductionists. We want a single cause here of aging. So, Liz, what's your explanation to aging?
Well, I think genetics is very informative with respect to this issue of both comorbid diseases and defining diseases. So you make a single change in telomerase, you end up with half the amount. So your telomeres in the people are very short. In the family, the grandparents have pulmonary fibrosis, a lung disease. You'd go to a lung specialist. The parents will have aplastic anemia most commonly. They would go to a hematologist. The child would, at an earlier stage, get something that looked completely different, dyskeratosis, their skin, their nails, and sometimes their gut. So it's a definitional issue where these things are one single nucleotide change as causing a different set of things playing out differently in the generations as the telomeres shorten and shorten. And they also have risks for cancers and so on. So there's a subset that you can say, if you don't have enough telomere maintenance, you can see a kind of quicker mimic with strange kinetics of onsets set of things that you can see going on in old age. So I think there's great studies coming out of some of the big cohorts in genetics. And so there's a very clear set of genes now where they clearly are involved in telomere maintenance. You can see them quantifiably related to telomere length maintenance. There's a set of about 7 genes that will define a cardiovascular risk factor, which accounts for about 20% of the risk. This is a very large study from Cod et al. Out of the UK and Europe. And so some genetic component to cardiovascular disease, you can now say there is some causality of telomere shortening in that disease. It's by no means all. The biggest factor remain socioeconomic. I don't want to for a moment exaggerate it, but if you're looking for causality and saying it's possible mechanisms, this is now a real contributor that these beautifully large genetic studies have convincingly shown, based on all the molecular studies of saying, we know what these genes do. So will that play out for other diseases that are often comorbid with cardiovascular, like diabetes, in which, cardiovascular has, immunosenescence components? Are they going to be sharing that sort of mechanism and accounting for that comorbidity that you see so often? That's an open question as to what extent that'll be true. But there's the germ of a mechanism there, which is, I think, accounting for some of it, conservatively speaking. Maybe more than we think, but the big factors look as if they're not genetics. As we heard earlier, 25% of the risk perhaps for, lifespan, for example, rates is genetic, and I suspect for the population, the genetic component is a minor but informative one as to mechanism, I think.
So could I just ask you a naive question?
Yes.
Are the genes closest to the telomeres worse off as we age?
No, our chromosomes are too smart to let that happen. They send out alarm signals as soon as the telomeres get dangerously short. But those are the signals that make a cell, quote, senescent, Hayflick's observation, and those senescent cells not only fail to renew tissues, hence aplastic anemia and so on, but they start spitting out pro-inflammatory and pro-tumorigenic factors. So this can start to have more systemic effects. And beautiful studies in baboons, long-lived primates, have shown really a decent percentage of fibroblasts, for example, 15% become senescent in the old baboons, and it just goes up with age. So perhaps the same numbers in us. I'm not sure what the corresponding numbers are. So I think we have at least one kind of mechanism, and it fits in very well with the damage idea that Tom was talking about, because this is one form of damage which then plays out, and it actually mucks up the mitochondria as well, so which then has its own knock-on effects. That's one part of the story, but aging is very multifaceted, and I don't want to for a moment imply that's, to use a pun, the end of the story.
Don't be shy. Craig, what's your thoughts on mechanisms of aging?
Well, I think one topic we haven't heard enough about yet is epigenetics, which, how often do you have to reinstall a program on your computer, right? Your computer's got hardware, and it's running a program. Well, cells have hardware, and they're running a program. So your somatic cells get programmed during development, and in some cases, the cells that you're born with, you're going to have your whole life, and they're going to have to carry out those functions without really ever forgetting what they learned during development about what their fate should be. It's really amazing, and we're learning a lot about how cells get programmed to do different things. One of the things I work on in my lab is the germline, which Tom mentioned several times in his talk. It's the immortal lineage, and when you study the germline, you find that it is full of machinery for programming, for putting epigenetic marks, and for controlling the which genes are on and which genes are off. And there's all kinds of interesting, biology relating to the control of this type and aging that's coming out now in the literature. It's really, really interesting. So maybe we just need to reboot our program or reinstall our software, and we'll all be good for another 100 years. I think that's and also the discoveries of John Gurdon and Shinya Yamanaka, which were recognized with the Nobel Prize. You can take a somatic cell and reprogram it, and you can make a whole new organism. So you can essentially give that cell an entire new lifetime by reprogramming it. It's the same cell, the same DNA. Obviously, it's maybe a cell that didn't have the DNA damage that would have precluded that. But I think it's a really interesting fact. I think maybe there will be some really promising new work from that kind of investigation that will lead to strategies that allow people to rejuvenate in a really remarkable way.
Cynthia.
It's along these lines, something that's very interesting is that, it may be possible to stimulate a rejuvenation program by changing environmental conditions. So let me go back to the gene changes that extend lifespan in animals. A lot of them affect networks of genes that respond to stress, nutrient deprivation or other kinds of stress. And what happens is that when in the laboratory you tweak these pathways so that they're a little lower than they should normally be, the body interprets that as a condition that would normally exist if the animal is under stress. So this is a big deal. It has a very large global response. It kind of rolls out a protective mechanism that acts on many fronts, on antioxidant fronts, on the immune system, on many others. And there are transcription factors, gene regulatory proteins like the FOXO protein that actually can instigate pathway or programs like this that are protective. And those programs, gene expression programs, can extend lifespan. But it turns out that it's possible. This is just one small example. It's possible to activate some of these programs by these gene responses that are protective by changing environmental conditions, for example, caloric restriction or starvation. And it turns out, at least in animals, that if you starve a mouse for a few days, and you wait a little while and do it again, when it's old, you rejuvenate its immune system. This has been shown by Walter Longo. So you actually restore stem cell proliferation to some cells in the immune system that would normally be declining with age. So it's made me wonder, I haven't done this, but it's made me wonder if I should just try this just a little bit, just to see whether it could boost your immune system. But it's very interesting. And I think those kinds of responses to damage underlie a lot of longevity mechanisms.
Personally, I think I would go for vaccination rather than starvation.
It's not long term, it's just a few days.
Oh,
I don't know.
oh, that's reassuring.
We'll see. I don't know either. I haven't done it.
Let's come back in a few minutes to what we can do to prevent aging, diets, stem cells, and so on. Craig, do you want to?
Well, just sort of related to this rejuvenation idea, there are these amazing experiments where you take an old animal and you like hook the blood supply up to a young animal. One of the speakers today alluded to this as a possible way of, it's called the vampire effect, basically. The blood of the young animal rejuvenates the older animal. It's an amazing effect. So yeah, that's probably not my first choice ways.
But there's a clinical trial. There's a clinical trial going on right now where someone is taking the blood of young people, because you can do these. You can do blood transfusions. They're done all the time. So they're taking the blood of young people to ask whether it's protective against cognitive decline in the elderly. Who knows? It's kind of scary to think about in a way. It's interesting.
I think the question you posed a few minutes ago and the discussion actually highlights one of the real challenges in the science of aging, because you asked about getting reductionist. And if you want to get reductionist, I mean, Liz, sort of with her wonderful discovery of telomerase and telomeres, you could do a very focused experimental study on how the events at the telomeres affect and interact with the aging process. Or Niels, with his interest in mitochondria, has got to do really detailed studies on the relationship between changes in mitochondria and aging. So you could have a whole lot of fun by setting up a sort of playground gang fight, if you like, where you've got all, Niels and his followers are throwing snowballs at Liz and her followers, and everybody is championing my mechanism is the mechanism. But then what we hear is that high-level things actually provides a degree of coordinate regulation of all of these different factors. And so what we have to achieve within the field, and I think it's difficult, it's doable, but it's difficult, is that we've got to know the detail. So we have to be intensely reductionist down each of these pathways. But we have to do that recognizing that what we will know is an awful lot about an awfully small piece of a much bigger picture. And so at the same time, we've actually got to develop research programs that allow us to integrate that knowledge. And to some extent, this runs counter to the way that science is done.
Well, I think not so much, Tom.
I think
people are now doing this. People are, doing studies in humans. I mean, my feeling is you've got to ask a human. If you want to know what's going on, ask humans what's going on, because there's lots of ways they can tell you, and you can be very driven by data and not ideology. I mean, you were sort of saying, there'll be different camps and stuff. Believe me, I was dragged into aging, kicking and screaming. I mean, I didn't. But then, as data started accumulating in actual humans, it got really fascinating, because it just kept saying some consistencies that said, okay, we're looking at the integrative picture, which is the organism, right? And the organism as it relates to its bigger society. I think that's a big part of how we do function, as we heard earlier. Our well-being is so tied to that intertiedness with the, one organism with all the other organisms, that we see biological playings out that do have quantifiable effects on measures of aging by whatever criteria. So I think I'm hopeful. I think the science, that tremendously powerful reductionist biology that we've all really, so many have done so well, has now started to move into more and more interfacing with the studies of the whole organism, which is really complex and won't reduce itself conveniently to reductionist. But the key question is, what of all the hundreds of pathways is the rate-limiting one? So that's where the genetics has been so important.
Exactly, because after all, I mean, that's been the road to success in medicine, clearly, is to take the reductionist approach and identify the rate-limiting step and treat that one.
Everything is rate-limiting. The one that rate limits is the one that matters in practical sense. And so for human aging, I think That's such an interesting interplay of factors that are showing themselves as good candidates for rate limiting.
You got the rate limiting steps, Cynthia?
I have first of all, I agree with everything Liz has said, and at your point, I wanted to follow up on that. It's very interesting. If you change these hormonal pathways that affect aging, this insulin and IGF-1 regulatory pathway, you get long-lived animals, long-lived mice, for example, and long-lived worms, whatever you study. If you look at the mitochondria, they stay young longer. They have fewer senescent cells. That's what Liz was saying happens when the telomeres get too short. Or from damage, you get senescent cells. These long-lived animals, at a certain time, they have fewer senescent cells. So somehow you have a high-level hormonal pathway that affects many of these downstream. It doesn't tell you which one of them is rate limiting, but they're all coordinately affected. And so one thing you could do is figure out which one of the downstream repair or protective mechanisms is rate limiting and change that one. Right. But another thing you could do is not worry too much about it. I want to know. We all want to know. And we really do want to know. But you could come up at a higher level and just change some of the high-level regulators. So for example, these transcription factors that are part of this insulin and IGF-1 signaling, like the FOXO family transcription factor, DNA variants in that gene are overrepresented in many populations in people who live to be 100, suggesting that transcription factor, which controls many things, is something that's under maybe some positive selection for lifespan, or it's influencing lifespan. We don't actually know how the DNA changes affect the activity of the transcription factor. We need to know that. We don't yet. But it is interesting. So for example, when we were in our lab 20 years ago, and we changed one gene, the DAF2 gene, in the worm, little tiny worms that live 2 weeks, we doubled the lifespan of the animal, and it stayed young for a long time. But we had no idea why. We didn't know anything about, and we didn't need to know. I mean, we want to know, but we did it without knowing what on earth we were doing. Now we're trying to figure out what we were doing and how we could do it better, as Liz was saying. But it's interesting that the top-down level really is a good complement to the bottom-up level. They come together, and they're both important.
Right. It's exercise, you see. It's a good sort of exercise. Is
exercise
a good example.
Like that.
Very organismal,
very much like
very
that.
Much at the organism level, and yet it's clearly going to play down.
Exercise your transcription factor.
With not too much, though.
It activates transcription factors.
Yeah.
So I think we all agree that aging is due to multiple types of accumulated damage, and some damage will be more important than other types of damage. For instance, I work on mitochondria, and you find a lot of mitochondrial changes and damage in aging humans. So the question many of us try to pursue is to find mechanisms that are conserved among species. So there one, of course, have to have some question marks. I mean, we all love if we find that reduced mitochondrial function can prolong life, which there is some evidence for in the mouse, in the worm. But how likely is this to be a general scenario? I think that's an important question. Is aging species-specific, or are there really strong conserved mechanism? Yeah, just to take a very drastic example. So flies, don't have telomeres, fruit flies, right?
No, but they have good end protection mechanisms.
Yeah, sure.
They just play another game.
Sure.
But I think it's a great question about there's naked mole rats, which we heard about earlier, and then there's blind mole rats, and they both have these very long-lived subterranean lives. But it turns out the mechanism by which they evade cancer seems to be a very different one. So that to me was quite startling, and says, maybe we really do have to think about species as how their individual histories have played out. We live in 80 years compared with a couple of years for a mouse. So the kinetics may very much be a different playing out of the same set of genes.
And this also raises the question of the model organisms we're using. Are they relevant? It's great to increase the lifespan of a worm from 2 weeks to 4 weeks. but how relevant is it for us?
That's
and
what's
if
so
you take a
nice.
mouse, it grows continuously throughout its life, I think. If you take fruit flies, they undergo metamorphosis where most of the cells die when they go from larvae to pups to adult.
I think that's been the big lesson of the last 2 decades, is that these model organisms, even yeast, are relevant. You know, yeast go through a certain number of cells. These are one-celled little creatures, just cells, and they go through a certain number of divisions, and that's it. And so, but it turns out you can change genes in them and make them go through more divisions, and those same genes, the products of those genes, can be inhibited by a drug in a mouse, and that extends the lifespan of the mouse. So that, I mean, there are many, way more. I don't even actually know any example of something that extends the lifespan of a worm that has not been shown to extend the lifespan of a mouse. I don't know one example. Inhibiting translation, respiration, insulin IGF-1 signaling, TOR, all these things seem to work. So there seem to be very ancient mechanisms, probably evolved to resist stress, to protect the body under dangerous conditions. It seems to be very ancient. And not only that, the point is it goes all the way to humans, because you can, it looks like, because these DNA variants in the genes that were discovered in the worm are overrepresented in people who live to be 100.
But it's a rather small contribution of each gene, isn't it?
Yes, well, you see, it would be great if we had people who live to be 400 and we could just sequence their genome, but we don't. So I don't know, but I think it does say that people are susceptible to the effects of these genes. And some bats, for example, that live very long, they seem to have natural mutations in these genes that replicate the long-lived mutants. So I think I think the question of to what extent a worm or a yeast is irrelevant, I completely agree with him that there could be new mechanisms that we'll get from studying new species, and I'm very supportive of that. But I also think that the amazing take-home message of the last 20 years of aging research is how unbelievably and surprisingly and unexpectedly conserved aging mechanisms are within model organisms.
I only want to add that, if you want to study aging, the unfortunate fact is if you study it in the human, you're not going to live long enough to see the results of your own work. So, unless you're extremely successful.
Not
right
according to James Vopal this morning. He says he's just going to keep going up.
Right. It's pretty amazing that we're already getting a life extension of 6 hours per day. I want to see that pushed up to 24 hours per day. That would be very exciting. But I do think we need model organisms. And the other thing I think is important is that you can really, if you want to study aging, you really just should study basic biology like Liz did. I mean, she didn't know that telomeres would turn out to be relevant to aging, like she said. I mean, I remember being really surprised that cells would be so silly as to not maintain their...
I mean, humans are really stupid, I'm sorry. It's like... we just don't get it, right?
But you never know where these discoveries will come from. And I think, there are people now who are purifying this, age or lifespan extending substance from the blood of young animals. I mean, can you imagine what that might be amazing new therapeutic of some kind. But anyway, I think it's really fun to cast a broad net. And if you focus too much, I mean, we make that, Tom mentioned how we have all these institutes that are studying different things. And it's not the right way to do science. You have to do the sort of the very broad science, basic science, and you have to have the people doing more clinically relevant work talking to the basic scientists doing work on yeast or protozoans or something, and that's where you get this cross-fertilization, or a hydra, planaria. There are amazing organisms out there that don't seem to age.
Yeah, and also we have now the opportunity to look into fantastic human databases with genome, transcriptome, population data follow-up, and so on, in addition to the model organisms. So the opportunities are great. But let's be practical for a while. From all this fantastic aging research, unfortunately, they agree about too many things here. We should have put in a demographic person here who would provoke them a bit. But since there is all this fantastic research and all these great models, What should we do to prevent aging? Come up with some therapy now. We need practical advice. Let me start with antioxidants, because we've heard it mentioned several times here. Is that the way to go? Nils, I know you've been working on that a bit.
Well, I think if you could delete all free radicals in your body, you would instantly drop dead, I guess. Because they have important physiological functions. I think oxidative damage and free radicals is a rather poor correlation with lifespan. I guess the naked mole rat has a lot of oxidative damage.
Yes.
So I think one has to do what I alluded to earlier. One has to look at different mechanisms that are relevant for humans and then try to understand which of these mechanisms has the greater impact. And if you think it's telomeres or mitochondria, you try to do something about that mechanism. And then, of course, you can also interfere with that mechanism in an experimental organism. And if you get it to live longer, that's pretty good evidence that this mechanism is important.
Tom?
You could be more. Oh, go ahead.
I think the way you pose the question, what can we do to prevent aging, I would argue is probably not the right question that we need to be talking about. We need to decide what we want to achieve in terms of improving old age. And there, actually, we come to a really interesting aspect of this discussion that we haven't brought out perhaps enough, and that's the distinction between mechanisms conferring longevity. So that's the kind of high-level regulatory stuff that Cynthia was talking about, and the mechanisms that actually drive aging at the molecular and cellular level, and that may be different between different age-related diseases. So we spoke of rate-limiting factors, but it could well be that there is a different rate-limiting factor for the way that aging affects a post-mitotic structure like the brain or muscle, and the way that it affects an organ in which cells are dividing. So I think the dimension of the discussion that within the field we need to move forward is, how do we identify which of the mix of factors is rate-limiting for individual age-related conditions? And if we accept that we're not going to cure aging, what do we want to be our highest priorities? I mean, you ask people what do they fear most about aging. Most people say dementia. My personal fear, when I get old, I really don't want to suffer from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, sort of emphysema. I can't think of anything worse than ending my days fighting for every breath. Whereas to go sort of vaguely into the world of dementia, I've had.
We're halfway there already.
Yeah, halfway there. No, but seriously, I've had relatives who have died of dementia, and it's a terrible illness. It robs you of the person you love. But after the first nightmare experience of realizing that you're embarking on dementia, once it's happened, it's not the worst thing in the world. There are worse ways to die.
Except for the family of the person.
For the family, sure, absolutely.
Exercise is the simple answer, right? I mean, isn't there epidemiological study after study where you can delay onsets of, things including Alzheimer's?
It's
right?
really interesting.
So it's really simple, practical, right?
I guess so far what's really prolonged life by reducing disease, admittedly, is improving nutrition and stop smoking.
Yes.
And controlling some risk factors for common diseases like blood pressure and cholesterol.
Like things that lead to metabolic syndrome and then its major symptom obesity. I mean, I think that, this 50% of cancers are regarded as, since cancers will limit the lives of many, right? Then if you think of 50% of cancers being avoidable, and some of it is tobacco, but others do include things like avoiding obesity as a readout of metabolic syndrome. So I think there's very doable things, and really it's a matter of I think it's a question of marketing exercise so that people love the idea of doing it. Because you see, most people say, exercise, right? So somehow that has to change. Well, we have extraordinarily successful, marketing ads that make us do all sorts of stuff which is not good for us. Why not use the same techniques to persuade people to do something that's actually good for you and is actually enjoyable. I like exercise.
Okay, folks, go to the gym after this.
No, don't. Just go walking.
Cynthia, quick comment here.
Go walking. That's all.
I just want to add one thing to what Liz is saying.
Gym.
There's no doubt at all that exercise is beneficial for the heart, for Alzheimer's disease, for many diabetes, many different conditions, but there's very little, just by the way, very little evidence that it actually makes you live longer, if any. That's very controversial, and it's not clear.
Healthier, that's the key.
Yeah, well, that's, but yes, no, that's what I'm trying to say. It makes you very healthy, which is terrific, but it's also interesting that it doesn't seem to extend lifespan beyond what centenarians already enjoy.
So that raises the question, what's our priorities here? Is it to extend life or prevent conditions of aging?
I think everyone agrees that the worst, it would be like going to prison in a way, would be to be able to live longer in an unhealthy condition. I think that would be the worst thing, and everyone agrees that the health span is the most important. I really believe that.
Right. My mom lived to the age of 97, and what really made her last part of her life unhappier than it could have been was when she was losing her vision and her hearing. And these, they don't shorten lifespan, but they make life miserable. Is that an inevitable consequence of aging, dry macular degeneration and damage to the hair cell, to the hair cells in the inner ear, or are we talking about specific diseases that we perhaps could do something about? Because I think we need to think not only about when you die, but how can we make life pleasant, and how can we live an active life as long as possible?
Well, there's so many technologies. You know, there's cochlear implants for the deaf, and so I think maybe the potential to exploit those kinds of technologies, so the hearing and the vision, there are ways that technologies have actually, you know, that improve the functionality of these. So I think perhaps they've been underused in the elderly and have been used for frank diseases in the young. But you know, there's terrific technologies that probably are just dying to be used to alleviate one by one the aspects.
Right. I think we have a few minutes left. So I wonder if there are any questions in the audience to this very optimistic panel. Yes, please. Can you? Yeah, it'll go take some time to get the microphone, so why don't you yell, and then I'll repeat your question.
I just wanted to ask about the link between cancer and aging. So, a few observations. Professor Kenyon, you mentioned that there is something about the age state that is carcinogenic across all species. I wanted to ask...
Quick question.
And the other observation from a clinical perspective is that people with cancer that present later in life seem to have kind of less aggressive. I was wondering what you thought about that.
Well, let me just say one thing first. I mean, the rapidly growing tumors, those we can by and large treat pretty well. It's the slowly growing ones that are killing people now. Tom.
I mean, the relationship is really interesting, as you say. There's fantastic overlap between the underlying mechanisms that give rise to cancers and that contribute to aging, and those involve DNA damage and telomerase changes and epigenetic changes as well. So there's great overlap in the pathways. It is very striking that cancers presenting in older people are less aggressive, but in a way it's not so surprising because you know, a cancer, in order to become highly malignant, it's got to use the host tissue to provide the blood supply and to provide all the ingredients for growth. So if you've got a malignant cell starting up within the context of aged tissue, it's just not such a promising environment to grow a very rapidly developing cancer. It's a compromised tissue environment.
Okay. Are there other questions out here? Please. Okay, so can we just fix the damage that is aging rather than figuring out what caused the damage? Can we answer that in a minute or two? Craig, you're a Nobel laureate. What's your answer?
Well, I'm not that optimistic, really, that we can easily just fix everything that's broken. And I also think that if you look at maximum life expectancy and not average, you see that there really isn't a 30%, but maybe only a 5 or at most 10% increase in maximum longevity. So I do think we're bumping up against a barrier biologically, and we may need not just to fix what's broken, but to actually add something new or replace something that was missing. And so there's maybe some more radical solutions we'll need to
Freshen up with a stem cell?
Yeah, stem cells might do the trick. Who knows?
Yeah. Let me just finally ask the panel here, how old would you like to be? We've given you a year and a half. I remember told you that.
I would like to live really like time travel into the future. I'm not sure that I could deal with chronologically millions of years, but I'd love to see what the world is like 1,000, 10,000 years from now. It would be fascinating.
He has high ambitions. What about you, Nils?
I would like to live until 1.5 years before I die, because because I think this last 1.5 years is not so nice.
Unless you get hit by a bus.
Liz? Yeah.
Well, I want to live a pretty good time because I want to learn neuroscience and I want to become a really good musician, and that takes time. So I don't know how long, but I need several decades here, and then Tom. I can just go overnight. I don't care.
Tom.
Yeah, well, I'm with Niels. I don't want to set a limit. I mean, in a way, while life is good, you want to live forever. But I think I don't want to live beyond the point where I don't want to get up in the morning.
Okay. Cynthia,
yes, I agree with these guys. Yes, I think so. I think I want to be contributing, and I want to be healthy, and I have so many things I'd love to do that as long as I can do that, I wouldn't just kill myself.
Okay. Thank you very, very much. Thanks. Great fun. Thank you. Now we're switching to what we'll...
snabbare och men kanske inte hjälper. Ja, men det får se eftersom han inte bara åt, men de andra ska också vara lite snabb för att passa. Och de fick ju inte någon tid. Ja, för att... Han hade redan börjat fråga, men du vet, de sitter längst bak. För de här.
Welcome back in case you had a chance to, welcome back in case you had a chance to take a micro break. We're back for a panel on the diseases of aging, and I hope it won't be as sad as the title of the topic says. Let me introduce the panel. We have Linda Partridge, you met earlier today, who is at the Max-Planck Institute for Aging and also in Cologne and also at University College in London. Mia Kivipelto from Stockholm, working on the epidemiology of aging. She has her own fan club here. And Ingmar Skoog from Gothenburg, Sweden, who is also working on the epidemiology of Alzheimer's disease. I worry a bit about two epidemiologists next to each other. But then on the other hand, we have Kandel, who is, as you know, a neuroscientist from Columbia University and won the Nobel Prize in year 2000 for his work on the brain. And finally, Ciechanover from the Kenyon in Haifa, Israel, who won the Nobel Prize in chemistry for his work on cell signaling and ubiquitination in the cell as a mechanism of controlling signaling in cells. So we have a broad panel ranging from the molecules to the population. And we have a number of questions here. We would like to start by looking a bit at the disease panorama, and then we would like to end up by prescribing some treatment for them, of course. But let's start. The main diseases that reduce life expectancy in our part of the world, and I think more and more globally, is cardiovascular disease, cancer, and dementia. So if we could treat these three, how much would we increase life expectancy? Mia?
Well, it's a good question, and it depends surely where you are living and when you get the diseases. We know that if you are 90 years old, so you have like nearly half of the persons have dementia already. There have been some calculations that dementia reduces the life expectancy like between 5 years if you get it when you are 75, 3 years if you get it when you are 85. So it really depends when you get the disease. There are cases who get Alzheimer when you are 65, and then of course it reduces the life expectancy a lot. Quite often this disease also co-occur. You get them together. So you can have both dementia, stroke, and heart diseases. I don't know exactly how much you can reduce and how much longer time you live, but you can do a lot. And I think dementia is maybe the major challenge now, because we have been able to reduce cardiovascular diseases and stroke. Dementia is the one that remains. This is really the major player, the key challenge in our societies. So for the future challenges, I would say that's the one what we should try to do. And I'm quite optimistic that we already have something we can do.
Of course, you realize that Mia gets her grants for research on dementia.
Oh yes, but as said, we are linking all the factors together. So integrated interventions is the way to go.
Well, I don't completely agree with Mia. Oh, good. Because I think we actually are. I think we actually, what it shows now is actually that the age-specific risk for dementia seems to decrease also, especially in the oldest age groups. So I think we are on the way there too. If you look at the age-specific, if you look at all people above age 65, the number of people with dementia will increase. But we are decreasing. It's not going to be that bad. And I think the important thing is also here that one of the major causes of that is that reduction of cardiovascular disorders and cardiovascular risk factors, because it seems to be so that many of the risk factors and the preventive things for Alzheimer's disease are the same as for cardiovascular disorders.
Are we dealing with a kind of chronic inflammation in the brain or in the blood vessels?
Well, inflammation is one of the things you see in the brain of people with Alzheimer's disease. But I also want to say another thing. I mean, we've done studies in Gothenburg since the 1970s of elderly people. And one of the things we see is that the reserve capacity in elderly people increases. For instance, stroke is one of the most important risk factors for dementia. In the 1980s, I made a career by finding that stroke was a very important risk factor for dementia. Today, when we look at it, the actual extra risk of dementia after stroke has decreased, mainly because of higher education, but also that people have much more reserve for many other different reasons. So we actually see quite a positive thing coming up. So I used to say that the best thing to prevent any age-related disease, and especially dementia, is that we increase education. And a side effect of that is that we will get more Nobel Prize winners.
Great point. Linda, please.
Yes, that comment you made about the association between cardiovascular risk or disease and dementia, I think it's a very interesting one from the point of view of some of the experimental work that we were hearing about in the previous session. Because we know now from many different experiments with different species that we can extend the lifespan of the creature by simple gene mutations, drugs that mimic the effect of those mutations, and by specific dietary manipulations. And that the animals stay healthier as they age. We can measure their behavior or the state of their tissues or what's going on in their cells, and by many different criteria, they're healthier. But what's interesting about those interventions from the point of view of aging-related disease, I think, is that they seem to capture many or all of them simultaneously. There does genuinely seem to be considerable common etiology between the diseases of aging. So, for instance, in the dietary restriction monkey studies that have been done in the US recently, there's protection against cardiovascular disease, there's clear preservation of brain and cognitive function, there's some evidence that musculoskeletal systems in better state. You know, a really broad spectrum preventative effect for the diseases of aging. And quite a number of existing licensed drugs. I mean, rapamycin is the most obvious one, but also metformin, which is the first line of defense against type 2 diabetes, even aspirin, are turning out to have a much broader therapeutic range than was previously realized, particularly turning out to be protective against cancer in the case of metformin and aspirin. So I think it's very interesting. This comorbidity could be regarded as a bad thing because it tends to mean that old people often have more than one thing wrong, but it could also be regarded as an opportunity because I think it's telling us something.
Aaron, could I ask you, do you think this points to a specific signaling pathway in the cell as being the driving force for all these diseases? Should we try to find that and get the ideal treatment and hit several birds with one stone?
No, I think that each disease, and even within a group of diseases, has their own mechanisms. Think about cancer. I mean, think about what happened to melanoma in recent years. You know, unleashing the immune system really made magic in melanoma, but it had no effect or probably will no effect on glioblastoma or other cancers. So we are talking, putting all these diseases, even cancer or cardiovascular diseases, or under one umbrella is not right, because each of them has a different mechanism, and each of them will have to be treated, I would say, partially independently. It's true that we find common denominators to many diseases, like mutations in tumor suppressors we find in P53 or in RB, or elevation of NF-kappa-B, some other transcription factors we find in certain diseases. But certainly, I don't believe that there will be a switch that will turn on or turn off a large group of diseases.
Eric, what's your thoughts?
I completely agree with you, but I do think there are sort of two issues. Reginald Dahl is probably more responsible than anyone else for the increase in lifespan from 50 to 80 now on average, from 1900 to now, because he emphasized smoking is dangerous for you, diet is extremely important for you. So there are some general measures, diet, exercise, etc., that are generally beneficial. But there's no question, for example, in chemotherapy, the major breakthrough was realizing that colon cancer is not one disease, breast cancer is not one disease, and subdividing it. So drugs that seemed as if they were completely ineffective when you focus them on the appropriate genetic target were remarkably effective. And I just want to give you one example in relationship to dementia. There was a discussion for a long time that as the population lived longer, it also lived better. So you began to see an age-related memory loss associated with age, and it was not clear, is this an early phase of Alzheimer's disease, or is this an independent entity? Recently, a number of labs, including my own, have been involved in investigating that together with Scott Small, and we found it's quite clearly a different entity. Alzheimer's disease begins in the entorhinal cortex. Age-related memory loss begins in the dentate gyrus. It begins early in life, and it has a different molecular mechanism. It doesn't involve the amyloid plaque deposition. It involves a Krebs signaling pathway, a protein associated with that. Krebs binds to the Krebs binding protein. It binds to a protein called RBAB48, which is a histone acetylase. That's the factor that is deficient in age-related memory loss. So making that distinction is extremely important, because it's quite likely this is therapeutically quite reversible with a number of drugs, while with Alzheimer's we're still struggling.
So you think we could prevent this condition by modulating the epigenetic control of,
yes, absolutely.
Of the genes in
that
fact,
part of the brain? This came up in an earlier discussion. The cross-perfusion experiments that showed that if you take a young mouse and hook it up with an old mouse and transperfuse them, the blood from the young mouse rejuvenates the old mouse, okay? What are the blood-borne factors? Recently, osteocalcin has been identified at a laboratory at Columbia that showed that osteocalcin is a hormone released from bone. And Kerensky was the person who discovered this. He found that this factor, which is in the blood, gets into the brain and it enhances cognition, including enhancing age-related cognitive deficits. Now, it turns out that bone mass decreases with age. So you have less osteocalcin. If you exercise, you increase osteocalcin in the blood and you improve memory. So one of the functions of exercise may very well be to release things like osteocalcin, blood-borne factors that could, in principle, enhance memory storage.
I'm a bit worried. We're getting this message that exercise is so good for you, and I'm lazy by nature. So, but I guess I have to listen. Linda. Oh, sorry, Mia first.
Yeah. I think it's fascinating to think about the mechanisms and what should be the main preventive target if we need to choose one. I think we have learned so clearly that late onset Alzheimer's disease is quite complex and heterogeneous, and there may be these different mechanisms: inflammation, oxidative stress, vascular, of course, beta amyloid. And maybe we should target all of them, because what has been a bit disappointing, we have the observational studies linking many lifestyle-related factors to Alzheimer's disease. But in the randomized trial, in the real interventions, the results have been not so positive.
But that has
yes,
another explanation.
Yeah, and I know, but one thing might still be that the multifactorial disorder, maybe we need to do even more.
You may be right, but in that particular case, it turns out by the time a patient comes to the physician with Alzheimer's disease, they've had plaques for 10 years.
Yes.
So the emphasis right now is to try early detection.
Yeah.
Imaging to detect plaques early, genetic screening for ApoE4, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. And
now I think I'm going to let Linda in.
Okay.
So just to come back on this question of common etiology, we may just disagree with each other, but I think we may also be thinking about slightly different things. I think what the animal studies are telling us is that if we want to prevent these diseases from happening in the first place, then we can look quite powerfully at the common etiology for all of them. It's very clear that cardiovascular disease is not cancer, is not dementia, and that one cancer is not another cancer. By the time you've transited into the disease state, you're looking at something very specific that you've got to treat. I think we'd all agree about that. But there's an earlier stage where the risk factors, the aging process itself, has many common features, and we can tackle it at that point. But we're talking about a preventative medicine, not cure once the disease has cropped up.
That's very attractive way of thinking of it, isn't it? That there are some lifestyle modifications that could be helpful in somewhat general terms,
yes,
in preventing or delaying disease. But once you have the diseases, you have to treat each specific disease.
The point is there's a fair amount of genetic evidence, for example, early onset Alzheimer's disease, to indicate that there are genetic predispositions for many of these things. There's probably a combination of factors that are involved, but there's certainly early predictions for many components of aging process.
Ingmar and then Aron.
Yeah, I think, one thing, I've come from epidemiology. I'm out in the wild world, outside the laboratory, and there it's more complicated. So I think, for the early Alzheimer's disease, I agree completely it's genetic. Late onset Alzheimer's disease, I think we could see that environmental factors are so important. And the interesting thing is that the environmental factors we see are similar to the ones we see for cardiovascular disorders. And then the other thing I think is interesting now, it's another thinking of disorders really, because we can see now that in cerebrospinal fluid, we can see changes in people who later get sporadic Alzheimer's disease 20 years before. And if we think about the risk factor studies which have been done, very few has been more than 20 years. So the question is, are we really looking to primary prevention? Maybe we should really try to diagnose very early, and maybe all these preventive things we talked about before, like exercise, like diet, and so on, maybe that's instead retarders of something which has already started.
Yes,
very well.
Yeah.
Could be. And there may not have to be a dichotomy between the early genetically driven and the later stages. If you take cardiovascular disease, so much was learned from the extremes that Brown and Goldstein analyzed, and out of that came the prevention with lipid-lowering agents that are used now everywhere, statins, to prevent also the more common forms. Aron, you wanted to come in?
I think that we have to make a real distinction between prevention and cure. These are two different schools. We can treat diseases. We can treat heart diseases by stenting, by replacing coronary arteries, but they will come back. You will have restenosis and you will have reaccumulation of cholesterol in the atheroma and so on. We can take a patient with a massive cancer and irradiate him and treating him with chemotherapy and try to operate on him and remove and then he will develop another one, either a recurrence of the first one, or it will be a secondary as a response to the treatment and so on and so forth. So curing is one issue, and the same. Theoretically, we haven't done it yet, but we can dissolve aggregates in the brain, but overexpression of chaperones, I don't know what, and then they'll come back. Prevention is another story, and it's much more exciting. The problem is that it doesn't attract people. Because, we can talk about exercise, but bring me one medical student to a medical school in order to teach him how to exercise. Nobody will go for it. It's nice, we have scientific evidence that it helps, but we don't know what's behind the exercise. We don't know what's behind the wine. We don't know what's behind there. But I think that putting the emphasis on prevention, and prevention is going back to the bench and understanding fundamental mechanisms.
Yes.
We need to understand what is the cause of the disease. And if we think about it, in the near future, we shall be able to change genes. You know, think about CRISPR. It's just behind the door. We shall be able to cut the wrong gene, trash it, and replace it. Well, it's a dream. I'm oversimplifying it. But we have to, without understanding fundamental mechanisms of disease, we'll never be able to overcome the problem. We need to go back to the bench.
That was a lesson to learn here, that we can prescribe some preventive measures. We need to learn much more on the basic level.
There is no short way.
I'm going to let Jens in here, who is picking up comments through the web from the outside world, outside of the conference room. Let's hear what do you have, Jens. Could we get do you have a microphone? It's coming here, slowly but surely.
All right. We have some input from our online audience here. So we've heard a lot about environmental factors like diet and exercise, which is related to the topic of obesity, which people are discussing here on Twitter. So what are the effects of this increased prevalence of obesity around the world on our lifespan, and how can we as a society address those effects?
Mia, would you like to?
Yeah, I could start. I agree. Obesity is really one of the big threats we have, and unfortunately, there have been no success stories recent years. There have been no really decline in any countries, and it's really increasing, especially in developing countries. So it's a big threat. And that has been said that is one of the major issues with physical inactivity and diabetes that will have the highest burden of the disease, because it's related with so many other chronic diseases. If we think dementia as an example, we have, as you said, Ingmar, we have some evidence that dementia incidence has been reducing, but given that now obesity is still increasing, how are the trends in the future? So I think everything what we can do here, and it's also a kind of political issue, society needs to help the person to make the healthy choices.
So there's also a follow-up questions regarding when we're talking about exercise and diet. There's this discussion about junk food and junk food taxes on Twitter. So what does the panel think about that?
Linda, you worked quite a bit on nutrients and aging and so forth.
Yes, I could probably comment on the content of the thing that you buy in the junk food store and its likely effect on your health. But the whole topic of behavioural modification, which is really what we're talking about here, it's trying to persuade people to make healthy choices when often the unhealthy choice is much more attractive and much more available and perhaps better priced. I don't think that taxing the food is necessarily going to help. I mean, I'm not an expert in this field. I shouldn't really be commenting on that specific policy issue. But what you want to do is to persuade people to behave differently. And if people are eating unhealthily, partly out of economic pressure in the first place, then taxing is not going to help. You need to use a different tactic. And I suppose the most important thing is to get people when they're young. I think teaching children about food and choice of food is extremely important.
Eric?
I think if we're speaking about prophylactic measures, one thing that we should discuss is intellectual involvement as people age. The evidence is by no means complete, but it's suggestive that intellectual activity, being engaged, learning new things, learning a musical instrument, learning a foreign language, learning new computer games perhaps even, might be cognitively beneficial and helpful for people. So I think that should really be explored. Being socially involved, the evidence is very strong for that social isolation leads to cognitive impairment. So these are the kinds of prophylactic measures, number one, that are suggestive to be important. We could do systematic outcome studies. And as Aaron suggests, we're now in a position with imaging experiments to find out exactly how they work, to get objective biological markers to indicate whether they're being beneficial or not.
You were quite pessimistic when it comes to behavioral modification. I mean, we have a success story, don't we? And that is the anti-smoking campaigns that were quite successful, at least in the 80s and 90s. Combination
until e-cigarettes came along, they were very successful.
Yeah. I guess. It was a combination of high taxes, high price, positive role models who didn't smoke, who don't smoke. You don't think we can translate that to diet?
Well, I wish I was more optimistic, but we didn't evolve to smoke. We did evolve to avoid starvation. And almost every neuromechanism in our body is geared to making us eat, to making sure that we don't starve, not to avoiding overeating when surrounded by abundant, affordable, very attractive food. I think that's the problem that we're all facing in a modern environment. And it's something that we're singularly ill-equipped by evolution to deal with because we didn't encounter a ready supply of food until very recently in our history.
So you mean that when we are working against evolution when we try to improve lifestyle?
I would disagree with that. I think we have not put enough effort into developing the social methodologies that would be convincing for people. Certainly what struck me, I'm older than several of you around the table, when I came into medicine, every clinician was smoking. You go to a conference, everyone would take out their pack of cigarettes. For decades now, no one has smoked. This became a culture. And cultural phenomena are very, very easy to become contagious. So we have to learn how to make these things part of the common culture. So it's the in thing to do rather than the out thing to do. Yeah. And there must be techniques for learning that.
Yeah, and just a short commentary, I totally agree. I'm also a bit more optimistic for the possibilities of changing the diet, but I think that it's not enough to only inform people. People know that they should eat in a healthy way, but it's more really the practical lessons. We have been conducting a large intervention trial for elderly people where nutrition was one part, and we really did quite a lot hand-on exercise, teaching them what they should think when they are doing shopping, how they should do the cooking, and that was quite successful. So maybe we need more hands-on.
Right. So we need to develop better methods.
Methodology, more pragmatic models.
The underlying logic of it.
Yeah. Ingmar, do you agree?
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, we need to find something. And also for this, with exercising the mind, being active with the mind, I mean, we have studies now showing that already in middle age, if you're engaged in art, if you're engaged in different social activities, intellectual activities, you can actually decrease your risk of Alzheimer's disease 30 or 40 years later.
Well, the interesting thing is that age-related memory loss begins before Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease begins in the late 60s, early 70s. When I was a medical student, we never saw Alzheimer's disease. It's a recent phenomenon. It's a present. So, I mean, Alois Alzheimer described it in 1906 or something like that. Age-related memory loss begins at 40. Even in a mouse, if you look at a mouse which never shows Alzheimer's disease, it's fine until it's about 10 months of age, 12 months, middle age. Boom, you begin to see a decline.
But if it had had a chance to do Sudoku and computer games, it would have lasted a bit longer.
What would be fascinating, and this has been touted, but there's no evidence to support it, there are various video games out there that are designed to improve your memory, your spotting skills, and things like this. It's hard to know whether they are task-specific, where it makes you better at video games, or whether it generalizes. If one can show empirically this really generalizes to memory storage, that would be a spectacular advance, because everyone enjoys video games. In fact, maybe that's the way to do things about diet and heart disease and other things. Put it on the video.
Yeah, that would be maybe. We should use the modern techniques and social aspect as well, doing things together to make it more fun.
Yeah. So we have some kind of consensus about at least some preventive measures we could do, although we are not that successful in convincing others to do it. What do you practice yourselves to prevent these dreadful diseases? Aron, what do you do?
Unfortunately, nothing.
That was an honest answer. What about you, Eric?
I try to swim many days in a week. There's a pool in the building right next to me. And Denise and I go for long walks on the weekend. I play tennis on the weekend. And I'm married to her, and that's an intellectual exercise full time.
What about you, Ingmar?
Well, I exercise and I eat broccoli and those kind of things. And
does it help, you think, broccoli?
Yeah, no, but actually going over to salad and trying to eat a salad diet, I think. Trying to eat fish, salmon. Okay. I'm actually doing it. Sounds maybe impossible, but it is possible to do.
Okay. What about you, Mia?
I hope being a researcher is cognitively stimulating enough to increase the cognitive reserve, and combined with some fun activities in life, hopefully that is a good combination.
Linda?
Well, for intellectual stimulation, I make many failed attempts to learn German because I live and work in Germany. That's a really difficult language to start learning at my age, but I keep trying. So that's the cognitive bit. I take a lot of exercise, and I largely ignore the messages coming from my own research on what constitutes a healthy diet.
Really? Are there any questions from the audience at this stage? We have one up there. Oh, okay, we can start here. And then we have someone up there after that.
Hi. It seems that age is a kinetics problem when we have on mechanisms like and off mechanisms. Like in this case, we have to balance both. Like for instance, for on mechanisms, that's a stem cells research where we can increase the amount of good cells. And good healthy lifestyles, we decrease the off mechanism, the destruction of cells. So we have to embrace both. Like all these new ideas are important in order to increase the study stage, the study stage of this process, like longer time in a very good balance and a good equilibrium. It seems that everything that we have been listening here is very interesting and very important, and hopefully we push very hard for distribute these ideas to the public.
I sense there's going to be a but after that.
Well, the most important thing is to bring these ideas to the public, and this is a good start. Thank you.
Yeah. One question you had in there, or one point you raised is the stem cells, and we touched upon that a little bit in the previous panel. Do you think we're going to use stem cells, say iPS cells, inducible stem cells, to repair damaged organs in the reasonably near future?
That's already being done to some degree. This is an extremely promising area. But there's certain kinds of macular degenerations that are being restored now with stem cells. And certainly people are working very, very hard to try to help people with Parkinson's disease and amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, things like that. The problem with stem cells is it's easier to use in other regions of the body rather than the brain. In the brain, you not only need to replace a cell, but you need to position it in a critical locus and connect it to appropriate other cells. And that specification of pattern of interconnection may not be programmed into the stem cell itself. So that's a very difficult thing. So if it's just a question of putting it into the macula per se without patterns of interconnections concerned, then it's fine. But if it's involved, for example, in the spinal cord, like the motor neuron, that has been more of a problem.
And we have a huge success in hematology, don't we? Where all the cells are floating
There's
around.
No connection
so you don't have
at
to worry
all.
about where they are sitting.
Absolutely no connections at all. That's brilliant.
Yeah. Aaron.
Well, we don't know yet. Think about Dolly. I mean, we reprogrammed her and she got aged very quickly and died. We don't know whether the stem cell is exactly like the fertilized ova. I mean, until we shall know for sure that the stem cell that we reprogrammed, the iPS that we reprogrammed, has exactly the same repertoire like the fertilized ova, then we shall not know what's going on. We don't know about malignancies, we don't know about anything. Actually, the first experiment in stem cell, the first well-organized experiment, is currently being done in Japan, in Kobe, on an old woman with retinitis pigmentosa. This is the first one, really, in the world, to show us that it's working. So we are optimistic, but cautiously optimistic.
In the retina, it looks very encouraging.
Linda, do you have a...
Well, from the basic research, there's some evidence that this kind of reprogramming happens naturally after stem cell exhaustion or tissue injury. It looks as though it may partly be a natural phenomenon within tissues. So perhaps the way forward in the future would be to exploit that using the body's own natural processes for doing it, rather than having to introduce exogenous cells where there may be problems that we don't know about. I think this is a very exciting area of research that's just starting up at the moment.
I guess a small molecule is always easier than a big molecule, and a big molecule is always easier than a cell for therapy, isn't it? Do we have any more questions? We have one up there. I don't think she got the chance, the lady up there. And yeah, let's hear.
Okay, I have a question in a different direction. From what I've seen, if you have the money, I guess you could cure all disease at some point, but the money needs to come from somewhere, and an economy only has certain resources to do that. Do you think that it's right to spend money or so much money on curing diseases to prolong life, while there are other other things on which money might be spent better on? For example, on other diseases like malaria, or I don't know, something in that direction?
Thank you. That's a good question. I had also intended to raise that, so that's a very good question to ask the panel at this stage. Ingmar, you raised your hand first, I think.
Well, I think when we talk about malaria, I mean, it's been very successful, but I think it's extremely important to look at the chronic disorders now, because what we have is an explosion of elderly people, of the number of elderly people in the developing world. So I think if we can treat this disorder, or even delay them, even if you delay them, the onset of Alzheimer's disease with 1 year, it has enormous public health implications. So we actually save money by doing something like that.
The main cause of death in India today is cardiovascular disease. It's not infections.
Yeah. And I would just continue. I totally agree. Also giving, as we already mentioned, that many of the chronic diseases share many risk factors. Integrated interventions for these major diseases may have a huge impact for the whole society.
But there was a part of the question was, can we afford it when the population will grow and grow? And it's the elderly part of the population. We saw these demographic mushrooms rather than pyramids in the morning.
But in a way, if you could only delay the onset, for example, of dementia, it has been counted that the amount of disease would be 50% lower after 50 years. So it kind of, it would have a huge impact. People maybe die for something else or live shorter time with the disease. That is what we hope. But still, the economic burden of these major diseases is so huge. So prevention feels as a very natural first step to take.
But the question was broader. I think that the question was related to whether the developed world should share its resources with the developing world. Whether in Sweden we should study malaria, that is not a problem in Sweden, or whether we should study cancer and aging, that is a problem in Sweden or in the developed world. And that's the question of how we behave globally rather than nationally. And we never agreed among nations what to do. I mean, task division and so on and so forth. We are in a way behaving selfishly.
It is, yes.
On the other hand, we're seeing these problems in the developing world. But I guess we would all agree that we have a responsibility to address diseases that are major problems in less privileged parts of the world.
Actually, I think that malaria is #1 killer in the world. We think it's heart diseases and cancer, but it's not. It's malaria.
But the thing is that we know that the number of people with dementia will increase from around 30 million to 140 million during the next 40 years. And the huge increase, the huge number there is in the developing world. And they're not really prepared for it. So I really think we need to do something. And even as modest as just delaying the onset a little bit might have huge implication also economically for the developing world.
Yeah, Maggie, you picked up something from the web.
We have a question from Ingrid Persky from Panama. She asked, why do women live longer?
Yes. It's unfair, but is there an explanation? Who would like to comment on that one?
Well, in a mechanistic, it depends what the sense of the why of the questioner is. It could be, is this an evolved mechanism for some reason, or it could be what are the proximate mechanisms. So I feel more inclined to tackle the latter, I think. And there's a lot of evidence that testosterone is a lot of the culprit here, because there are some demographic data from castrati and from court eunuchs who were castrated in Japan particularly, showing that that leads to a considerable increase in lifespan in men to the point where it comes to equal that of women. So I think sex hormones have got a lot to do with it proximately.
Are there any therapeutic implications of that knowledge?
I think we'll leave that one alone.
Okay. Anything more you'd like to? Yeah. There's one more question here.
There's been some mentioning of the experiments where old animals receive blood from young animals, and I'd like to hear the panel's view on, is that going to work, and why hasn't this been developed a long time ago, given it's such a low-tech intervention?
Blood transfusions against aging.
It is not considered aesthetically a very satisfying treatment. And also, it's a fairly primitive kind of experiment. What you'd like to do is to use this assay to find out what are the specific factors in young blood that give you this restoration of function in the older mouse. If you can identify it, and I'm suggesting osteocalcin may be one of these, if you can identify the 5-10 factors in young blood that are responsible for this restorative thing, then one is in a position to give them in pure form to the mouse, and then maybe give it to primates, and then give it to humans, if there's, the usual kind of safety trials. But that's a very good strategy, and people are thinking about that.
But the recommendation is use the scientific approach rather than the Dracula approach.
Science helps.
Great.
I'm with Aaron. More knowledge is good.
Let me finally ask you the same question I asked the previous panel. How long would you want to live?
I'm completely with my colleague Nils-Göran Larsson there, until 1.5 years before I die. I thought it was a very good answer. I'll do without that last 1.5 years. Otherwise, I hope to enjoy it.
Here in Scandinavia, 1,000 years ago, the Vikings had something they called ättestupan, which essentially meant that they brought the old people up to a tall mountain and then they pushed them down. So if that can be done 1.5 years before the expected death, then maybe that's the solution.
Off the cliff.
Mia.
Yeah, it's the same thing. It's difficult to give any limits, and I think the expression that it would be so curious to see how world is changing, what we can find, what we can see, until I feel I have something to give and I can enjoy the life. That's my limit.
Yeah, I would also like to know what happens in 10,000 years, as someone said before.
There are those who are very ambitious, I must say. What about you, Eric?
I'm also curious, but realistically speaking, I think a more important thing is how one dies. I would not like to, be predeceased by my partner by a significant period of time, like to, die at about the same time she does. But I see a finite life as being a desirable thing for me. I wouldn't like to go on indefinitely. I don't know what the magic number is, but it's certainly not significantly beyond 100.
Aaron, finally.
I'm less demanding than my friends. So I would live 1,000 years, but in pieces. So 10 years and die for 100, 10 years and die for 100. And then... and then satisfy my curiosity and see the progress and how these problems, awfully complex problems, are being solved.
So curiosity prevails. With that, I think we should end this session. Thank the panelists and thank the audience.